At the class reunion, everyone started teasing Nick to kiss Victoria. Blushing, he kissed her. Victoria didn't push him away. Instead, she fiercely deepened the kiss as everyone cheered. No one knew she and I had been married for 4 years. When the party ended, she drove a drunk Nick home and left me to walk the nearly empty streets alone. She didn't come home that night. The next day, there were fresh hickeys on her neck. 6 months ago, Victoria started seeing a guy, the very Nick she once despised with a passion. I had chased her and cherished her for nearly 10 years before we married. For 4 years of marriage, I always made the first move. She was convinced I'd never leave her. I finally realized, it's time to let go. At the high school reunion, drinks clinked, and the noise of laughter and casual insults filled the air. Victoria sat by me, not too close but not too far, downing drinks gloomily. Her moist eyes looked heavy, like time itself had become a sharp blade, cold and distant as ever. I knew she was mad, but her mood had nothing to do with me. I followed her gaze across the room to Nick, sitting in the corner. He always seemed rather quiet. Maybe it was the alcohol, but his usually pale face flushed a light pink, making him look handsome. Next to him was Lily, frequently offering him food and trying to chat. He occasionally responded with a smile. Both Victoria and I knew that Lily liked Nick back then, but people never seemed to buy into the idea of them as a couple. After a few rounds of drinks, we started playing a game of truth or dare, and Nick lost. Everyone egged him on. Nick, go on, kiss Victoria. Don't chicken out. They clapped and encouraged him. Drunk and flushed, Nick hesitantly stood up, unsure of what to do. The guy behind him gave him a nudge, pushing him in front of Victoria. Thrown off balance, he almost stumbled into her but was steadied by Victoria. Cheering exploded even louder around us. Amidst the teasing, Nick lowered his head and gently pressed his lips against hers. Everyone held their breath. Their relationship had always been intriguing. Victoria wouldn't care about social norms if she disliked it. But she didn't push him away. After a brief pause, just as he was about to pull back, Victoria grabbed the back of his head, her fingers weaving into his hair as she fiercely deepened the kiss. The corners of her eyes were slightly reddish, whether from drinking too much or something else. The crowd erupted into applause and cheering. Somewhere I heard someone say, "Is my OTP finally happening?" I looked at the wine glass before me, watching the swaying red wine reflect the dim lights inside, making my head spin. Everyone knew I pursued Victoria throughout high school, but no one knew we had been married for 4 years. No wonder they shipped Victoria and Nick. They had a story more compelling than ours. The more they opposed each other, the more they seemed like they were meant to be. I remembered back in high school, plenty of folks rooted for them. Once, I casually tested her feelings. Jokingly, I asked, "Everyone thinks you and Nick are a thing. Do you like him?" Victoria stopped writing, showing clear disgust. "Anyone but him. Don't mention his name, it's revolting." She hated Nick because his mom was a mistress. Victoria always thought Nick's mom was to blame for her parents' divorce. Later on, Victoria's dad and Nick's mom got together. From then on, they both loathed each other, with Victoria hating Nick more. Although 3 years later, that blended family fell apart, Nick's hostility toward her eased, but Victoria never wanted to hear his name. Even on her birthday, she accepted everyone's gifts but slapped away the little cake Nick brought, making him leave in anger. On his birthday, when others wrote nice messages, she wished him a lifetime of broken dreams, making him cry. Never thought she liked him. The teasing was so loud, it only made my head buzz. The glaring lights above me, the clinking glasses, the playful mocking, it all blurred into a haze. For a moment, I couldn't tell if it was a dream or reality. Not until deep into the night, as stars began to twinkle, did people start leaving one by one. Nick was drunk. Someone nudged him over to Victoria. "Victoria, can you take him home?" She held him up, heading to the car. Nick kept mumbling all the way, no idea what he was saying, but he stumbled, leaning on her, until Victoria pushed him into the car. As she bent down to get in, she didn't notice me at all. Their silhouettes under the streetlight looked like a couple who'd been through thick and thin. I stood under another streetlight, called her name Victoria. She paused, seemed to just remember I existed. She turned to look at me. Her features were clear, reminded me a bit of her younger self. She frowned slightly, showing a rare sign of impatience. Go home by yourself. He's drunk. Seeing I didn't respond, she gave me a look. Her voice was a bit cold. Don't be so stubborn. You weren't like this before. Then she got in the car. The car quickly vanished on the quiet road. Oh right, I used to not be like this. I tried hard to think. Yeah, from when we started dating to getting married, I seemed to take charge all along. She never thought I would leave her on my own. Never thought I'd have the heart to do it. Didn't think I could do it. I looked down, counting on my fingers, liking her, chasing her, being together for nearly 10 years. Married for 4. She took up half of my past. The place was remote and it was late. I tried to hail a cab for ages, no luck. In the end, walked nearly an hour home. The only regret, I should have driven my car tonight. Halfway home, light snow began to fall. It was a bit cold. Pushing open the door, inside was dark and silent. This seemed colder. I covered my aching stomach, staggered into the room, felt around for the light, and nearly knocked over a painting on the wall. I turned on the light. The room became bright, a bit harsh. Squinting slightly, looked at the painting on the wall. I hung it up, framed in glass, kept it clean. The painting was of Victoria, back in first year of junior high. She was my desk mate. While she slept, I secretly sketched her pose. The girl in the painting had long lashes like butterfly wings, touched by the thin morning light from the window, a butterfly's dream, flickering gently. Back then, sneaky me, lightly touched her nose. Didn't realize my finger had ink on it. Her nose now had a smudge of color. While I pondered nervously how to wipe it off, Victoria woke up. Later, when she saw my masterpiece, rarely mad, she flicked my forehead. Little troublemaker, holding my forehead, feeling wronged. Yet my lips curled smugly. Just thinking about this, my phone buzzed. Checked my phone. It was James. Felix, you okay? Scrolling up the chat, James had sent me some videos days ago. Since I've known Victoria, I thought her personality was always serious. From dating to 4 years of marriage, her emotions were calm as water. Whether it was an anniversary or any event, she showed little expression. I thought that was just her, until I watched the videos James sent. I realized she wasn't always serious, not unromantic. She just saved her warmth and smiles for someone else. They walked together, traveled together, stayed in hotels. Watching the videos James sent, I almost didn't recognize her. She'd sweetly serve someone food. Her eyes held a gentle affection. She'd tenderly stroke his hair, let him rest on her lap. Even the last video, 6 months ago, Victoria officially kept Nick. In front of the school, beneath the tree where I confessed to her. They kissed. James, a school teacher, just happened to stay late working. Saw them when leaving the campus, recorded it secretly. None of the classmates knew I married Victoria. Our wedding had no elaborate ceremony. She found it complicated, and I didn't like the fuss either. So we just had a family meal. James was friends with Nick for years. He hesitated long before sending the videos. I finally recalled what happened that day. Victoria seemed visibly upset. Now I know why. She heard Nick was to be married. After graduation, Nick had a rough time. His family burdened him with troubles. Later on, his parents forced him to marry a wealthy woman. She liked him, but he didn't feel the same. On the wedding day, Nick ran off, ran to Victoria. No wonder that day, when Victoria's phone rang, she left, barely touched my birthday cake. You eat the cake. I thought it was urgent work. Turned out, Nick had sought her out. In the video, Victoria initially met Nick. She looked indifferent. Weren't you supposed to be getting married? Nick isn't the type to cry much. That day, he kind of had a meltdown. He pulled Victoria aside and cried while talking a lot. I wasn't there. I don't want to get married. Basically, he bailed on the wedding. He had a lot on his mind and didn't know who to talk to. She was the first person that came to mind. Victoria didn't react or say anything. Then, Nick saw her silence, turned around, and said, "Fine, I'll go get married then." Victoria's expression changed. "You wouldn't dare." She stepped forward, hugged him from behind under the lilac tree, and kissed him. Afterward, she said, "I'll give you 50 grand a month. I'll take care of you." Nick got angry, raised his hand as if to hit her. "Victoria, don't take it too far." But his hand never came down, and he looked a bit humiliated. He likely needed money because there seemed to be someone sick in his family. That's how Victoria started to support him. But the way she treated him wasn't like any ordinary lover. James shot a few videos for me. He randomly stumbled upon Nick a lot. Nick lived near the school, so James often ran into both him and Victoria. After watching the videos, my stomach churned, feeling really uneasy. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. In a dizzy moment, I remembered how I had proposed to Victoria 4 years ago. I thought she would reject me, but she accepted. It was only recently that I linked it all together. 2 days before I proposed, I heard Nick had a new girlfriend and was about to get engaged. Then they split up 6 months later. I wandered out of the bathroom, tired as hell yet unable to sleep. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat by the window, looking at the neon cityscape, listening to the clock tick away. Victoria didn't come home that night. Not that this was the first time. I used to think she was a workaholic and just went to bed early. By the time the sky started to lighten and the first light crept in, I heard the door open. Victoria walked in and looked surprised to see me awake. I turned to look at her. She didn't say anything, just acted calm as usual. If I hadn't seen her pretending with such passion while kissing him, I'd think this was her normal behavior. She glanced at me, and as she turned away, I noticed strawberry-colored marks on her neck. I slowly stood up, maybe because the snow outside made everything feel so cold. My mood was eerily calm, with only a slight, prickly sensation left behind. "Victoria," she stopped in her tracks. I moved my aching shoulder a bit, adding an undertone I didn't even notice myself. "Let's get a divorce." When I spoke, Victoria didn't react, so I couldn't tell if she heard me or not. With her usual composure, she changed clothes and didn't pause till she reached the doorway. Then, she stopped briefly, as though she hadn't heard me right. "What did you say?" she asked, still tying a scarf, turning to look at me. I stared outside silently, slipped the wedding ring off my right hand, laid it on the table. "Did you hear me?" The glinting diamond wedding ring looked dream-like, almost surreal. All these years of marriage, I'd rarely taken it off. But Victoria never wore hers. As the ring clinked onto the table, there was a fleeting flicker in Victoria's eyes. But the moment passed quickly. She tidied her scarf, slightly furrowing her brow. "Don't be childish. I have a lot of work today. I'm heading to the office." She left. Only then did sleepiness begin to take over. I turned and flopped onto the bed. The untouched sheets, cold and unforgiving, took a while to warm me up. "Oh, Victoria, Victoria," I chuckled, shaking my head. "Am I just stuck here? Or did you forget to move forward? Did she forget I'm no longer that young? I don't have the courage and patience to chase her recklessly like before." I stepped out and didn't return until evening. James texted me, saying she and Nick were sitting by that lilac tree outside the campus. I drove over there. After parking, I didn't approach them directly. I stood quietly a short distance to their right, watching them. Nick seemed unchanged over the years, always youthful and striking in his demeanor. They were on the bench, with rows of winter-barren flowering trees behind them. Victoria seemed a bit restless, frequently checking her phone. After a while, she finally took it out again, hesitated a bit, and typed on her screen. My phone buzzed. I pulled it out. She messaged me on Instagram. "What are you doing?" I stared at those words for a while, feeling the urge to laugh. Thinking hard, I realized it was the first text she ever sent me. In the past, I often messaged her, sharing interesting things, only to get a lukewarm okay back. I got used to it, thinking that this was just her style. Now, it just seems kind of funny. Since getting with Nick, she probably talks more in those videos James sent me than in all our years of marriage. I didn't reply, tucked my phone back into my pocket, and finally started walking over to them. Hearing footsteps, Victoria looked up. The moment she saw me, I figured she'd at least look a bit panicked, caught cheating and all. But surprise, her first move was to shield Nick sitting next to her. The surprise in her eyes was there for just a moment. Then it was like watching a calm lake again, like she knew I wouldn't react at all. Or maybe all those years of me chasing her made her think I'd never leave. Nick, sitting next to her, looked at me, all nervous. I ignored him, reached into my bag, and pulled out the divorce papers, handing them to her. Take a look. If it seems fine to you, we'll sign it. Victoria took it, and for the first time, that calmness of hers started to crack when she saw what was written. I didn't wait for her to speak and just turned to head for the car. Think it over, read it through, and then call me. I opened the door, got in, and drove off. From the rearview mirror, I saw Victoria suddenly stand up and take a few steps towards me, until I turned a corner and she disappeared from view. Back at home, I lay on the couch, staring at the wall until my eyes got tired. When I closed them, I remembered the day in our sophomore year when I confessed to her. A bunch of my friends were around, making a scene of it. I was so nervous I couldn't see anyone clearly except her. James was there with a grin, recording it all, and the only thing I heard was her saying okay. Not too long ago, I found that old video again, and in the crowd I saw Nick. Before Victoria said yes to me, she looked his way just once. And when she agreed, Nick dropped his gaze and walked away. Thinking back, it was shortly after Nick had started dating the class beauty from next door. Mulling this over, I let out a smirk, tossed my phone aside. My heart felt heavy, like it was stuffed with cotton. Turns out I've been a stand-in all along. Just something to get at him. What a clown I've been, revolving around her like that. In the end, it was nothing but a one-man show. No wonder people thought we broke up ages ago, even though we never actually did, just 'cause she was always a little distant. I took a deep breath, about to toss all these tangled thoughts out, when my phone rang. Hearing it, I didn't realize it was my phone right away, because I set a special ringtone for her, and it never, ever rang. I let it ring a bit before opening my eyes and picking it up. I didn't say anything, just waited quietly for her to speak. Victoria spoke first, asking why I wasn't at home. I glanced around at my place, then at the time on my phone. It was 6:30. She actually came home. Hard to remember the last time she was back this early. I lowered my gaze, my ringless right hand tapping on the table. If you're sure about it and you've read through it, then sign it. Let's find a time to go to the Civil Affairs Bureau together. Victoria took a deep breath on her end, her voice dropping a bit. Are you throwing a fit because of Nick? I paused a moment, my grip on the phone tightening, my voice turning cold. Shouldn't I be upset, Victoria? Since chasing after her all those years, I'd never talked to her like this. Always soft-spoken around her, never once raised my voice. She seemed stunned on the other end. Lightly tapping the table, or do you think I should watch you be with Nick and still pass my blessings your way? Should I keep happy, endure it, because from beginning to end, it's always been me pleasing you? Is it just because I fell for you first I'm supposed to keep my head down? Do you think I don't have feelings? I walked over to the window, looking out at the expansive night. No need to pretend to like spending every day with me if you don't mean it. Once those papers are signed, we go our own ways. I had a lot to say. Then there was silence on the line for some time. Just as I was about to hang up, her voice was suddenly strained and tense. Who said anything about a divorce? Where are you right now? That last question hit me hard. A pang of ridiculousness and humor. Her first sort of caring words, yet we were at this point of no return. I replied, long night ahead. Thought I'd see which girlfriends are out and pick one to hang with. Finished talking. I switched off my phone and threw it onto the bed. I lay down, staring up at the ceiling. The apartment was pretty new, the place I'd planned for Victoria and me to stay. I really liked this spot because of the open view when you open the window. But we barely lived here before she said she didn't like it, so we moved to where we are now. Thinking back now, it wasn't that she didn't like it here, it was just that the other side had it's closer to where Nick lives, right? It wasn't until I finally turned my phone back on the next day that I realized Victoria had been trying to reach me all night long. There were dozens of missed calls and countless messages waiting from her. If this were before, to see her so desperate would have made me so happy. But even if she spent the whole night looking for me, she couldn't figure out where I was. If it were Victoria who went missing, I'd find her in no time. I know her likes and dislikes, her favorite hangouts, and which friends to ask if she disappeared. But Victoria's different. Maybe it was only last night that she realized she didn't have any way to reach me. She's never cared about what I enjoy doing or where I spend my time. After knowing each other for over a decade and even being my wife, she knows less about me than a colleague she's worked with for just 6 months, absolutely nothing. I finally replied with a message. Sign it, or if you want to go to the Civil Affairs Bureau, let's do it. Just contact me. For a couple, it's shocking we've become this distant. After freshening up, I went to work. It wasn't until evening that Victoria finally found me. Honestly, I think she had to scroll through our chat history to figure out where I worked. I was already packing up to leave when she walked in. Seeing her, I suddenly didn't want to leave just yet. I kept typing away at my keyboard, thinking maybe burying myself in work is a good idea. Victoria approached me, her voice soft. Felix. I hadn't heard her say my name like that in who knows how long. For a brief second, it transported me back to our youthful days. My nose stung with emotion, but I kept typing, pretending not to hear her. My coworkers glanced over at Victoria, with a few new grads even sneaking pictures of the pretty woman. A colleague sitting next to me grinned and asked, Felix, is that your girlfriend? Victoria's expression froze for a moment before she corrected him. Standing next to me, his wife. My straightforward colleague blurted in shock. Oh, so you're married? Victoria's face darkened further. Didn't you clock out? I'll take you home. I really had clocked out. Most coworkers were already headed out, leaving just a few behind, still wrapping up their tasks. Typing away, I paused for a few seconds, then continued, working late tonight, not heading back early. Those were phrases she often used. I figured with Victoria's typically indifferent attitude, she'd just turn and leave. But surprisingly, she sat beside me, saying, I'll wait for you, just like I used to wait for her back in the day. Whether she had after-school cleaning duty or some other task, every time she turned around, I'd be there waiting. Focused on the screen, with a touch of irony, I asked, what's your angle now? For her, our marriage should be a burden, right? Being with me certainly can't be as joyful as being with Nick. Why suddenly cling on and not get divorced? I couldn't figure her out and didn't want to anymore. On those countless nights of waking up alone, I've thought enough to exhaust myself and lower myself to dust. Now, thinking back while I was tossing and turning, she might have been comfortably asleep, enveloped in warmth. Victoria didn't respond. She sat beside me quietly for an hour before leaving. I didn't even lift my eyes. I knew she wouldn't be patient with me. But to my surprise, Victoria came back with a packed dinner. Eat something. Opening the box, the sweet and spicy scent greeted me. I glanced at it and passed it to a coworker, who happily accepted. Victoria's expression darkened even more. Felix, stop being childish. My coworker turned in confusion, looking back and forth between me and Victoria. Felix, aren't you the one who dislikes sweet and can't handle spicy? Victoria paused, stunned for a long time. Slowly, I replied, yeah, because the one who likes the sweet and spicy stuff is her. I used to pretend to like it too. It's like Victoria had turned into the high school version of me, reaching out for contact and trying to win me back. But I was coming home later and later, still living separately. It wasn't until I opened the door and smelled the aroma wafting from the kitchen that I was taken aback. Heading inside. In the dining room, Victoria had prepared a full spread, neatly arranged and still steaming. Nothing spicy. The warm yellow light made everything feel cozily softened, resembling the home I once dreamed of. She finally remembered we used to live in this house. Seeing me, Victoria removed her apron. Come eat. I glanced at the table silently and walked to the living room, already ate out. The serving spoon paused in her hand. I no longer had the energy to care about her every move or thought, as I used to. I started organizing my room, pulling a book from the shelf to read on my own. Victoria didn't make a sound, and gradually, I almost forgot she was still in the house. It wasn't until I had showered and entered the bedroom, exhausted and ready to sleep, that I noticed someone beside me. I opened my eyes, feeling utterly unfamiliar. Victoria had never gone to bed before me. Accustomed as I was to sleeping alone, when she wrapped her arms around me from behind, all I felt was turned to stone. Her warm breath by my ear, she murmured with a deep voice, like a rich wine tempting, "Let's talk about Nick's situation again." Those words were like cold water, snapping me back to reality. Even now, she couldn't let him go. Talk? Talk about what? Gently, I pried her hands off. No need to talk anymore. And so I turned into the Victoria of the past, coming home late, very late. Or I'd rather crash at James's place than even see her. She started coming home early a lot, like I used to, chasing her. She became more and more concerned about my every move. She's dragging her feet about the divorce, finding all sorts of reasons not to sign. I'm not in a hurry. I'm even curious to see how she'd try to win me over. Watching her hopeful attempts to surprise and warm my heart, only to walk away disappointed time and again. Watching her, I realized that's how I was when I pursued her. Victoria's colder than I am. Back then, when I was chasing her, I hit way too many walls. It got me wondering how I stuck around for so long, so small, humbled to the ground. Was it maybe this pitiful persistence that made me seem trivial and cheap to her? Pondered, swirled my glass, and shook my head with a smile. Everything easy to get in this world always ends up being taken for granted. Felix, check it out. There's a guy over there. James poked me. He's looking over. Huh? Is he checking you out, Felix? In the bar, under the neon lights, I spotted a delicate figure. When the woman turned her head, her face was pure as snow, a touch shy and out of the ordinary. Just one glance, and I was thrown off. She really had an uncanny resemblance to Victoria back in the day. I was so spaced out, I didn't even notice. The woman part the crowd and walk up to me, until she finally stood before me. She shyly pulled out her phone, asking for my contact. James chuckled on the side, nudging me. Honestly, this isn't the first time this has happened to me. I seem to have this knack for attracting women like her. Before I could answer, someone grabbed my wrist hard from behind, a voice dripping with anger. Felix. I turned around. Victoria stood there, holding a big bunch of vivid roses. The fragrance hit me right away. She grabbed my hand, with a ring gleaming coldly on her finger. My own hand was empty. She glared at the woman for a moment, then gave me an icy stare. My eyebrow raised slightly. What's up? She leaned closer, trying to swallow down her anger, saying, It's our anniversary today. I was even more surprised. Isn't that something you never cared about? I laughed as I spoke. In all our anniversary years, she was never around, either too busy or some other excuse. Victoria froze for a bit. She silently thrust the roses into my hand. Let's go home. Home. I looked down at the roses, still wet with droplets, then tossed them into the trash bin nearby. Victoria had no time to stop me, just turned to look at me, her eyes clouded with emotion. James leaned in, seizing the moment, added, Felix is allergic to pollen. Didn't you know? I shook off her hand, avoiding her stunned and dimming eyes. I didn't push Victoria to sign every day. I didn't bring up the drama every day. But after 6 months, Victoria finally gave up in despair and agreed to sign. I knew, being cold-shouldered daily, having your hopes dashed over and over, even if it's just little things, all of it adds up, becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. The more I looked at her, the more I saw myself back then, young and passionate, full of patience and reckless energy, unwavering courage. Now, with my current self, I doubt I'd last even 6 months. We signed the divorce papers at home. I was calmer than I expected, like the storms had passed, leaving a cold, quiet sea. Victoria drank a lot, her whole being reeked of alcohol. I knew she wasn't into drinking. I walked into the room, saw the picture frames on the wall. There were two. One was a drawing I did of Victoria. The other was our high school graduation pic. Victoria had put them up. I used to think she hung that photo because, when we took it, I stood just one row below her, directly in front. When I take a good look now, it was Victoria back then. The direction she was looking in, the person standing there, was clearly Nick. Their story, if I hadn't been in the middle of it, probably would have been one of those heartwarming tales of mutual secret crushes coming together. I looked away and glanced at the picture I had painted hanging nearby. I reached out to take it down, but just as I touched it, the frame, not being securely hung, fell on its own. As it dropped, my fingers twitched as if to catch it, but I pulled back eventually. Out of nowhere, a hand shot past me, trying to catch it, but it only barely grazed her fingertips and fell to the floor, shattering into pieces. Glass shards flew up, cutting her fingers, the blood staining the floor. Victoria didn't seem to notice at all, bending down to gather the broken frame and torn painting. "Why didn't you catch it?" Her voice was a bit hoarse. "You painted it, didn't you?" So she knew. I thought she didn't. It had been hanging in the room for so many years, and she always walked past it without a glance, never asking once. The glass shards continued cutting her fingers, coloring the floor red bit by bit. I grabbed her hand. "Don't clean it up. What's broken is broken. Even if you piece it back together, it's never the same as before." "Does it hurt?" she asked, looking at her wounded hands. "No. What hurts is the old me. If I had known all love had to be guarded, it wouldn't be so exhausting now to even think about love." The halted glass shards stopped. She slowly looked up, her long, beautiful eyes meeting mine. It was the first time I saw her with this expression. Eyes shattered like scattered glass, impossible to piece back together whole again. She reached out towards me, trying to touch my face. "Don't get divorced. Can we try again?" I avoided her hand and turned to the table, signing the divorce papers and shaking my head. After finishing up the divorce process with Victoria, I suddenly felt much lighter. As we left the civil affairs office, I went east and she went west. I didn't look back until I got into the car. Only then did I realize she was standing not far from where we split, just staring at me, like a lost child. I tore my gaze away from her, pressed the gas pedal, and drove away. For once, it wasn't me following her, watching her silhouette vanish. I knew Victoria would end up with Nick. Even during our divorce proceedings, she never said she'd let Nick go. Their public announcement of being together didn't surprise me at all. But their breakup news came so fast it shocked me. Less than 7 days after Victoria and I divorced, what was once a relationship in the shadows finally brought to light, yet ended so quickly. James sent me a screenshot of Nick's Twitter. Nick had written something like, "Turns out you just like the thrill of skirting boundaries. If I'd known, you should have told me sooner." Her weariness with the relationship arrived quickly, shocking everyone. Since that day, I stopped trying to follow whatever updates there were about Victoria. But news of her reached me now and then through mutual friends. I heard Victoria got the photo I had dropped restored, and she put it on her desk, often staring at it absent-mindedly. I pawned our wedding ring, yet she still wore it. One day, snowflakes floated outside my window, and when I pulled back the curtain from the high rise, I saw her in her gray coat standing by a lamppost, gazing silently at the rarely populated road. It reminded me of when we were in high school and I stubbornly waited in a snowstorm to surprise her for her birthday. I pulled the curtains back, pretending not to see her. I've grown accustomed to a life without Victoria. The once empty and lonely house feels warm and tidy now, set up exactly how I like it. I can cook the meals I love without having to think about whether she likes them or not. I can spread out on the comfortable bed without waking up in the middle of the night to an empty space beside me. The following summer, I packed my bags and traveled far and wide, visiting many places. Sometimes I had friends with me, and other times I went alone. I saw the clear blue sea and the desolate desert, watched eagles soar across the sky, and climbed mountains to watch the sunrise and sunset. I stood before snow-capped mountains, scooping up a handful of ice-cold snow. These were things I once wanted to do and see with Victoria, which she always found reasons to avoid, yet somehow had the time for someone else. Some close friends told me Victoria had changed. Even friends from her company tried to persuade me. I think she genuinely regrets it now. She still hasn't taken off the ring and hasn't gotten close with other men. Maybe you guys should consider getting back together. When I got their message, I was watching the sunrise from a mountain peak. I looked down and typed back my response, no thanks. Not all things are worth forgiving, and not all beautiful sights require two people to see.